29 minutes is it.
Yeah.
You know?
So, and I personally feel the music that we have, at the beginning and the end of the show, like bookmarks the show really well.
Right.
To like end a good episode.
Right.
And so.
Well, that's what the music is. The music is there as a pad for them to either keep it in or use, but they don't cut out any of our talking.
Right. Well, I noticed even though we're doing 29 minutes, we're still talking even after the 29.
I know, but I edit that.
Oh, you do.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're bringing it down with even a touch of music on the 29.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. At 29 minutes, we're done talking. At 29 minutes, the last part of us is done talking, and I'm gonna try to get it down to where the music ends at 29.
That's what I was hoping. Just even if it's just a little bit, because having the music bookend us, our show is a good that's that show. That cool funky music.
Oh yeah, we're thinking the same thing.
Awesome. Okay, sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. Okay. Well,
yeah.
Well, let's start over.
Yeah. Totally.
So 2 extra minutes.
You wanna just delete all that?
Yeah. All right, you ready?
Sure.
Okay, Country Dog, City Dog, episode 17, Urban Rural Violence, in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
You're listening to Country Dog, City Dog. My name is Kevin Levy.
And I'm Don Merrill.
And today we have a great episode. Today's episode is Urban Rural Violence, or violence in the urban rural areas. And does it differ? Is it the same? Do we all have a commonality right there?
Well, I think if you live in the city, you kind of probably consider yourself an expert on urban violence for sure. I mean, we get episodes and updates from the news on a daily basis of violence in the urban spaces. But violence in the rural spaces is a little harder to get a beat on.
Really, why is that?
Well, because first of all, the rural stations don't really focus on the urban environment. That's one thing. And, 2, we don't really, there aren't a lot of people who are in a rural environment who can come to the people in the urban environment and say, this is what life is like for us out there.
Right.
So we really don't know. If you don't live in the country, you don't really know what's going on in the country except, from what you may hear or what you assume or whatever. And the research shows that it's very different than what I think a lot of people think. A lot of people think that the rural environment is very bucolic and calm and peaceful, which it is. I mean, the environment certainly is, the farmland and the fields and the mountains, but the people are the same. People are still people.
Sure. So I have a question. You living in a rural part of Oregon, I'm assuming you are able to hear about the news in the urban parts of Portland and other large cities in Oregon. Do they focus on the violence to kind of say like, hey, this is why it's so great to live out in a rural area. There's just too much violence in the urban parts.
Well, they don't say that. I mean, they don't, when they have a news story, they don't say Portland sucks, this is why you should live in Malala, But I think what if you live in, a rural community, a lot of rural communities have Nextdoor. That app?
Yep.
Okay, a lot of people in a lot of rural communities have Nextdoor. And Nextdoor is city and country. And, Nextdoor tells you, what's going on. It tells you, if somebody's barn got broken into, somebody's car got stolen. So that's a good thing. I know that some of the smaller communities also have these things called granges, which I didn't really know what they were until I moved into the country. Granges are like these old community gathering places for towns where, maybe once a month or twice a month, people from the community sort of get together, maybe for a spaghetti dinner or, pancake breakfast, and they just sort of talk about what's going on in the community. That's kind of a good thing.
Sure.
But statistics still show that people who live in the country, like for instance, I forget who it was exactly, the CDC. Okay, so the CDC has the job of keeping track of shootings specifically. Because the CDC sort of sees gun violence and shootings the same way they see a virus. Because it has the tendency to spread, it pops up for no reason, it'll run its course, burn itself out, and then pop up someplace else. Behaves just like a disease. A dis-ease. That's what shootings are. Sure. And so the CDC, they're following it because it's behaving like a virus. And you know, the violence in the urban areas in 2020 went up by like 30%. You know, it was a 30% increase over previous years. But violence in the country went up by 25%.
Wow.
I mean, it was not that far off. You know, which just goes to show that, you know, just because you live in the city and you think the city is violent, I mean, don't get lulled into a false expectation that the country is peaceful.
Sure. You know, there's many reasons for an individual to become violent. Violent crime has many reasons. There's drug use. There's poverty, mental illness. There's family instability. There's social issues. There's a wide variety of reasons. But I feel, in my view, what the difference is between the rural and urban communities is how the lawmakers deal with those issues, how they deal with drug use and poverty and mental illness. And I'm not saying there is one right or wrong answer, or this set of lawmakers is doing it the right way or not. That can go either way and be a discussion into itself. But what I recognize is, again, those lawmakers in rural communities, how they deal with mental illnesses and the funds that they want to direct towards, or the funds they want to direct towards getting drugs off the street and helping to resolve some of these issues that are creating violent crimes.
Well, you know, like I said earlier, I mean, it's easy to make assumptions about what's going on in the rural areas regarding crime, but, you know, as a journalist, I can tell you that the question is always, is there more of something or is the reporting better?
Mm-hmm.
You know? Like when the Wall Street Journal looked at crime in the urban or rural environments, you know, back in 2020, like I said, you know, they were really surprised that, you know, crime jumped by 30% in the city, but it jumped by 25% in the rural areas. I mean, they just kind of freaked out over that. Like there's this prosecutor in White County, Arkansas, right? And she's a prosecutor. And she said that she attended a murder that happened in 2020. It was the first murder that happened in 2 years. And by the end of 2020, there were like 11 more murders. She couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. So, like, in cities, violent crime gets blamed on, you know, police pulling back because, you know, police, they kind of pulled back after all the social justice riots, right? Because they were getting all this pressure that they were, you know, being overly aggressive. And so, you know, some people say, well, maybe there were a few waves of blue flu going on. You know, the police just kind of pulled back.
She said the blue flu?
Yeah. It's kind of like the police were like saying, okay, you want to deal with this, you deal with this, you know. You're going to criticize us for the way we deal with it, you deal with it. And cities did not do well. And then there was all the loosening of gun laws,
Yes.
right? I mean, just like a lot of states and a lot of legislatures, you know, just said, okay, you don't like, you know, in some places, you know, you don't even need a CCL. You don't need a concealed carry license. You don't need to have any training. All you need to do is have the money to go buy a gun.
Right.
You know?
That has not helped.
No, well, you know, it depends on which side of the, it depends on, we'll get to that. We'll get to that.
Right.
But, you know, and then there's, you know, all these efforts to release, like Governor Brown. You know, Governor Brown, before she left office, she initiated this action to try to reduce the population in jails by helping put more people back out onto the streets. I guess she saw it as a way to try to, you know, either reduce the population in jails or help these folks who maybe were in jail on lesser crimes.
Yeah, to my knowledge, she was not allowing violent criminals to be part of that. Like, it wasn't,
Right.
It was for lesser offenses, drug possessions or shoplifting or things like that do not involve violent crimes.
Right, but I mean, you know, if you're a citizen and you're seeing violence all around you, and then you hear that somebody is letting criminals out of jail regardless of what they're being let out of jail for, it's like, who are you working for? You know? And then the last thing that really struck me was when the city abolished the gun violence reduction team, because that was like an anti-gang type of thing, you know? And you know, the city tried to put a good face on it, and they brought back the team under another name, and it was supposed to be more, you know, had more racial equity elements to it, but, you know, still, violence continued to spike. I think there's been like 20 murders in Portland this year so far.
Oof. You know, the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program, they state that the violent crime is composed of 4 different offenses: murder and negligent manslaughter, forcible rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. And what I'm going to take of that is we all, regardless of where we live, we all want our community to be safe. We want our children to be safe walking to school or their favorite shopping center. That right there is something that urban and rural, suburban and all, we can unite behind, that we want to feel safe and protected in our communities. But how we get there and the laws that are in the books is, that's the crux of it all, of figuring it out.
Well, we talked about all the violence in urban areas. I mean, you were talking about kids want to be safe, walking to the stores. Like, kids can't even be safe in school. In the middle of the city, in a school building,
Right.
So, but, getting back to the violence in the rural communities, like, in this article, I read about a place called Flathead County, Montana. And it is so far north, it shares a border with Canada. It's got 1/6 of the population of Portland, and they had 20 murders in 2020. For a place that's got 100,000 people, 20 murders is huge. For rural communities with and so here's the other thing rural communities are dealing with. Unlike the urban communities, rural communities, they got small sheriff departments, they got low budgets, they're not really experienced dealing with so many homicides. And, they got a lot of ground to cover because those states are huge. There's lots of space between those little towns, So the good thing for these little sheriff's departments, is that, because they're small, because the town is small, because everybody knows everybody, there isn't as much bad blood between the local sheriff, and the community as there might be between, cops in the city and the neighborhoods, So that makes it even harder for people to explain, well, then why are there so many murders, So one of the main explanations is they think that the problem is like a breakdown of social connections, right? Brought on in part by the pandemic and brought on in part by all this divisiveness in our politics.
Yeah, you brought up something. The Heritage Foundation did a study. They found that a future criminal, the makings of one, and it's not always the case, is a child as early as first grade who is continually rejected by their peers. Just for whatever reason, they just don't have the communication skills. I don't know, but they're continually rejected by their peers as early as first grade and continuing on throughout their school. They're just rejected and alone. And on top of that, what they found, a future criminal, after the studies they reported, is a father that has abandoned their child at an early age. And the key word is being abandoned, not divorced or, father moved on but staying in contact with the child, but just straight up abandonment.
Right.
And so those are two interesting things that I've found, that they are interviewing criminals currently in our system, and they're recognizing that pattern right there.
Well, I think it's interesting that a report like that came from the Heritage Foundation because, as you know, the Heritage Foundation is a pretty conservative organization.
Mm-hmm.
And that research sounds like a recognition of the fact that circumstances can affect people, and not just people of one group, but people of all groups. So that's
Absolutely.
And the other thing about that is, like, we all heard about that news report about a month and a half ago where that 6-year-old shot his teacher. Where did that kid get it? First of all, what was the mindset where a child could bring a gun to school? And there's so many things to unpack there. How did the kid get the gun? How is it that other kids knew the kid had a gun, but the school didn't do anything about it? So many things to unpack about that. So there it is. It's like the Heritage Foundation made come to life. Right there.
Right.
Go ahead.
So violent crime. People will always be committing violent crimes. People are going to be going to jail. But let's talk about now that they're in jail. Like, how do you feel about, in order to be let free back into society with at least a minimum of 1 year, at least, that they have to go through like a full educational course of just learning the basics and learning life skills, learning industries of plumbing, electrical, drywall, whatever, plus just something so that they're coming out of the prison system just that much stronger and ready to go towards tackling life.
Well, let me ask you first, is this like country, urban, rural, is this like an urban, rural related question, or is this like a, a rehabilitation question in general?
Yes, rehabilit in general, because there are criminals everywhere, regardless of living in the country or city. And so this is just in general that no matter who you are listening to this, do you believe that felons, as before they have the right to get out, they should have at least a basic educational understanding of basic high school education, as well as learning a trade skill before?
Well, a lot of people think, well, yeah, that's all well and good, but who's going to pay for that?
Well, there are currently people in the system right now that are, all the janitors and the cooks and the staff and everyone that's in the system right now. That's sure they're being paid for through our tax dollars and.
Well, no, I can push back on that, because a lot of these prisons are private prisons, and so they don't necessarily get state funding. They may get a state subsidy, right? Like if you have so many prisoners, if you have so many beds that are filled, the more beds you fill, the more subsidies you get from the state. It's not like you're getting taxpayer money per se. It's like that money's been set aside by the state for the private prison to operate in that state and employ people in that state, sort of like when, a state brings a big tech company to the state and they give them tax breaks on the land or something. It's not like they're getting tax money per se.
Well, then maybe it's a little bit of wishful thinking, but then the state needs to lay down the law and basically be saying, if you want our subsidies towards your prisons, then here's what you got to do in order before this person can be let free into society.
It works. Unfortunately, Kevin, it works both ways, because the prison company can say, well, if you want us to bring our prison to your state, and employ all these people and provide all this property tax for you, then you'll give us what we want, But anyway, getting back to, your question was, should these people be given training and stuff like that? Okay, I want to touch on that before going back to this other thing. But I think that, I'm not sure how much of a responsibility it is of the state or of the prison company for that matter, to sort of like, repeat the education that people may have already gotten in elementary school or high school or whatever. But I do think that things related to, stress management, anger management, things that have to do with, making people aware of how important it is for them to be able to, I don't want to say write a resume, but I mean to be able to, be a functioning member of society,
Yeah, but that 70%, according to Simmons University, 70% of felons that leave the prison system that do not have an education, they came in without an education and they're leaving, they end up coming back into the prison system by creating more crime.
Recidivism rate is high.
So how can we prevent that 70% who's going to be let back on the streets to do another criminal intent? That's something that's affecting you and your friends and my family. That's like, I would, if it involves more tax dollars or putting a halt on the private prisons, to say, hey, let's take care of this known issue and we can make our streets safer just by educating the felons before they get out. Wouldn't that be a win-win?
Yeah, I can see your point. I can see how that would be a benefit to society and to those folks as well. If they were open to it, because you can't, even if someone's in prison, people can still be pretty adamant and resistant as to who they want to be and how they want to behave and how they want to be treated and what they want to be told what to do or what not to do.
What's your thoughts on this? A judge saying on prisoning sentence, like your sentence is 2 years plus an average C grade in order to be set free. Like, can a judge even do that?
Kevin, I don't know. Now you're talking social services and all kinds of, I don't know. But I mean, it's probably worth exploring, and I'm sure some smart people out there are exploring it right now. Because recidivism rates are high, and they end up just costing. They end up costing for the same thing over and over and over. But anyway, getting back to some of the situations in rural communities that sort of explain why crime has gone up in some of the rural communities. The religious community, they point to things like fewer people involved in rituals, like in church services or town gatherings, or neighbors have gotten more hostile to each other, across the fence, and so what happens is what used to be disagreements have turned into conflicts, and what turned into conflicts have turned into violence, in the rural communities, some of those social connections that we think rural communities naturally have, even they started to break down because of the overall pressures that all of society is facing. There's psychological stress and financial stress brought on by isolation and job loss. There was dramatically high increase in drug use, first opioids and now fentanyl. And because rural economies may not be very resilient, social services were already lacking in some of those communities anyway, and then COVID came in and just knocked the hell out of them. And so, the pandemic only made the ability for people to find help for themselves worse.
Sure. I heard you talking about just the guns in rural communities, but according to the National Criminal Justice Association, rural communities, they have more gun violence and gun-related deaths than in urban and suburban areas. Again, this is per capita. The top cities with the most gun violence and gun deaths are in rural communities. And is it because gun laws are more laxed? Is it because more people have guns? Yes, that answer. Both are yes.
But having guns in the rural community, first of all, it's not as restrictive as it is in the urban community, but it's not restricted for a reason.
There's a lot more hunting going on.
There's more hunting going on. There's more. People have more of a need to feel like they need to defend themselves and their family because they're not surrounded by as many people. They don't have a big city police department, to protect them. So the sheriff and they work together.
Yeah, but what happens when someone who's lived in the rural towns most of their entire life that are comfortable with the gun laws that end up having to move into a large city that still feel that, I'm more comfortable carrying my gun around.
I would have to say that. That strikes me as more of a hypothetical because I can't imagine anybody
It was hypothetical.
I can't imagine anybody who lives in a rural community, who has lived in a rural community their whole life and loves the rural lifestyle, would choose to move to a city. It's like
it happens all the time.
Yeah, but I'm sure I can't imagine, like you said. Now they got, they used to have like 9 guns and 3 of them they could carry around on their person every day into the grocery store, and now they can't do that at Safeway.
Right.
People look at them like, are you going to be a mass shooter? They don't know who these people are.
Right.
I don't think anybody who's lived in the country would ever want to move into the city.
What I want to see is lawmakers from the rural and urban communities get together and create an across-the-board, like just policies across the board to help figure out ways to resolve violent crimes. Has it happened yet? Nothing that I've seen, and I follow pretty regularly, nothing I see in even many of the states that I follow regarding that rural and urban community policymakers have put an across-the-board just laws to say this is what we're going to do to figure out how to clamp down on violent crimes. There's always headbutting, and there's always an argument that one side's being too restrictive and the other side's being too soft. And we're not there yet. What it's going to take.
Oh yeah, I went to a community meeting the other night for one of the neighborhoods here in Portland, and the argument was there's too much mommy energy and not enough daddy energy. As if to say we've gotten too soft and we need to bring in more restrictions and bring down the hammer a little bit more. I'm not sure if that's the answer either. I do know that looking at the rural environment, by the time spring 2020 rolled around, in a lot of these small towns, and the national crime statistics sort of like bear this out. Fights between strangers and acquaintances and even friends and family got more deadly. And that's according to the local sheriffs and prosecutors, the people who know these people. And, the killings were spread out, so it's not like they were connected to a gang. Not like in the city where I was talking about the elimination of the gun violence reduction team, because a lot of violence may be connected to gang retribution. It was like that wasn't what was happening in the rural environment. And it wasn't like people were coming in from outside causing these murders and doing all this shooting them up. It's like these were people who knew each other. So it wasn't like, you could blame it and say, oh, these are outsiders. No, these were your neighbors doing this stuff. And like that Arkansas prosecutor I was talking about, I mean, it got to the point where the only thing she could say was, well, please stop killing each other.
Huh.
I mean, that was the best she could do.
What was that case from?
That was the one I told you where she hadn't had a killing in 2 years, and then by the end of the year, there were like 11 more.
Oh,
yeah. So, I mean, there were so many. She had so many killings that she told her staff, at the end of the day, turn your phones off. Go home and take care of your own friends and family.
Sure.
You can't be there. This is so overwhelming. You can't deal with it until you come back to work 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. So just turn your phones off.
Right.
I mean, that's where it was.
Oof. Urban and rural crime, violent crime. That, I feel, can bring us together. It should bring us together. As I was just mentioning earlier, we all want safer communities, regardless of where we live. That it should be at the heart of every single person is just feeling safe and feeling just at peace. Even I remember being comfortable walking around downtown Portland in the nighttime, and there was never a concern. And now I open up a newspaper, and there was a violent crime that happened on this corner or that corner, and I no longer feel safe. I don't want my child hanging out with friends down the block at night, just riding their skateboard at night in an empty church parking lot, because there's going to be a drive-by. I mean, I'm not saying there's going to be, but now that thought enters my mind, and maybe it's always been. Maybe it was like that when I was a child.
Right, there it is again. Like, is there more of something, or is the reporting better?
Or is the reporting better? Exactly.
Right.
So part of me just has to just let it go, but part of me doesn't want to let it go.
They're like, so like, what for the rural environment, like, what are the solutions? They're not much different than they are for the urban environment, I mean, if you reverse engineer the problems, there might be answers. Like, first of all, how do you strengthen ties in small communities? How do you re-strengthen those ties between neighbors, Some of the stuff that has happened in the last few years, maybe they've started new feuds, and those feuds can be blood feuds. They can last for a long time, not unlike, gang retribution. So it's like, how do you deal with that, Another thing is law enforcement. Law enforcement needs bigger budgets. Getting back to what you were saying about legislators, they need to give these law enforcement agencies more money, because in Oregon a few years ago, one of the law enforcement agencies in one of the southern counties, people wouldn't vote for tax levies, and so the sheriff went out of business, and they thought they could handle their own crime issues with guns and dogs.
Right.
And then they realized after a few years, no, we need the police. Even those anti-tax folks realized, oh yeah, we need the police. So there needs to be more coordination between like smaller agencies and larger agencies, smaller towns, they need to be able to rely on cities or counties or states or even the federal government to help them deal with crimes that they're not used to dealing with. And finally, there needs to be more coordination, with social service agencies, right? Because even what we saw with Measure 110, all that money was put aside, but then there was no plan to put the money to work. And so,
what was Measure 110?
Measure 110 was the measure that was supposed to legalize certain drugs. But then there was supposed to be a component that helped people deal with addiction.
Sure.
So the drugs were legalized, but there was no infrastructure in place to help people deal with the addiction. And so it just ballooned out of control.
Right.
So, that just shows the social service network has holes in it.
Of course.
Whether it's in the city or in the country.
To our listeners, what do you feel would be great solutions on helping when it comes to violent crime, solutions that we can all come together and agree on? And that's a tough one, but we would love to hear your solutions. If you go to countrydogcitydog.fm and reach out to us and tell us your thoughts on this subject.
Yeah, and like I said, this is one of the many subjects that we talk about on a weekly basis. And we're not the experts on any of this stuff, but the whole point of it is just to get a conversation started, you know, not just between us and us, or between us and you, but between you and you.
Right, you and your friends, you and the family listening to this show, which you're doing on a weekly basis. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. So, I mean, that's all I got.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening to Country Dog City Dog. My name is Kevin Levy.
And I'm Don Merrill. Cool.
Yeah, great.
That was a good one. Okay.
Thank you. So that was 17? Episode
Yeah,
17.
17.
Urban rural violence. Whew. Tough ones.
Yeah.
Let me just turn on the heater just a touch.
Okay.
And I'll turn it off. I played my ultimate frisbee last night in the rain. And it rained non-stop the whole friggin' time.
It didn't sound like it stopped you.
Oh my, it did not. Oh my god, my hair's a disaster. It was so cold and it rained and my fingertips would not close to clasp that frisbee.
So were other people out there with you?
But yeah, there was a few hundred of us.
Oh my god, a few hundred?
Well, I mean at least a couple hundred.
Wow, that's a
yeah.
lot.
Yeah, and it came down nonstop. Well, there's 16 teams times 20 people. What's that math?
So what is it, like 320 people?
There we go.
So then what, so you're saying if there were like, was it like a tournament or something?
Nope, it's our spring league. It's spring league, and
Okay.
basically everyone who signs up gets put on a team going up against other teams.
Okay.
And a lot of those teams are friends. I have many friends on this team and play competitive